Welcome back to TJ's Porch Garage. It's time to service the Toyota Avanza. Check out my other videos for replacing the engine oil, air filter, coolant, and even the sway bar links. But in this video, I'm going to be replacing a broken steering rack boot, as well as draining and refilling the steering fluid. The first thing we have to do is to lift up the car and remove the front wheels. This steering rack boot is torn and leaking. I'm not sure what exactly is leaking, probably some kind of grease. Anyway, we have a new boot to replace this torn old one. So let's detach the outer tie rod so you can get the boot off. You'll need 2 spanners to break loose the tie rod nut. And now you can turn the inner tie rod, which will push the outer tie rod out. Since I don't want to send the car for an alignment after this job, I'm going to count the number of times I'm turning the inner tie rod, so that when I reinstall the outer tie rod, I'll just turn it in the opposite direction the same number of times. Using a pair of pliers, you can remove the clip on the outer side of the boot. And with a flathead screwdriver, you can loosen the inner clip. Now with the help of the same screwdriver, you can slide the boot right off. My new boot is a bit longer than the original, which is not ideal, but it does compress to roughly the same length as the original boot. Make sure both ends of the new and old boot are the same size. Since the larger clip on the original boot was not exactly reusable, I'll be using a zip tie to secure this end of the boot. Here's a tube of silicone grease. Before installing the new boot, apply some of this grease onto the insides. Now we can slide the new boot onto the inner tie rod. There is a groove on the inner tie rod which the boot should slip onto. And remember to reinstall the clip. The steering rack also has a groove for the boot to fit into, and this side should be secured with a zip tie. Make sure that the boot fits securely and does not slip out, and test it by turning the steering wheel all the way from the left to the right and back. Here you can see that because my new boot is longer than the original, when the steering wheel is turned all the way to the left, the end of the boot is getting a bit squashed. Ideally, I would replace this with a slightly shorter boot in the future. However, the boot is still secure and is not getting in the way of any steering components or suspension, so it's fine for now. With the boot installed, we can now reattach the inner and outer tie rods. So get the tie rod nut back in place. And I'm just marking the inner tie rod so it's easier for me to count how many times I've tightened it. And now you just have to reattach the outer tie rod by tightening the inner tie rod. If you have been counting the number of times it took to detach the outer tie rod, then you can maintain the car's alignment by tightening it an equal number of times. Make sure to tighten the tie rod nut as well, so that you don't lose your car's alignment as you drive. So that's the steering boot done, and now we want to drain the power steering fluid. To drain it, you need to first remove the engine lower cover by undoing some bolts. With the lower cover removed, we can see the entire steering rack as well as the fluid hoses. To drain the power steering fluid, just remove the low pressure hose. That's the hose that is held in place by a clip. Once the hose comes off, the power steering fluid will start flowing out, so make sure you've got a bucket or a pan to catch it. This fluid is at least 4 years old, but it still looks pretty clean and nice and red. The old fluid will not all flow out on its own, so you have to pump it out by turning the steering wheel all the way to the left and to the right. Repeat until no further fluid flows out. Now I'm going to just do a little bit more flushing by pouring some new fluid in to help push out some of the old fluids. That's about as much as we can do to drain the old fluid out. So now let's clean off the hoses and tighten them back so that we can get some new fluid in. Pour in the new fluid from the reservoir. The Avanza takes Dexron II or Dexron III automatic transmission fluid as the power steering fluid. When the reservoir gets full, stop and then turn the steering wheel to the left and right, and this will bleed out any air in the system. You should see the level of fluid in the reservoir reduce slightly as you pump the air out. So top it off until it reaches the maximum cold mark on the cap. Next, start the engine, which will turn on the power steering pump and let it run for about a minute. This will get rid of any remaining air in the system as well as circulate the new fluid throughout. You don't need to rev the engine. I had also changed the coolant, so I'm just revving it up to see whether the temperature remains stable. Link in the top. While the power steering pump is running, check the lines for any leaks. Since we have let the engine go up to operating temperature, you have to check the level again, and now you can fill the power steering fluid up to the hot marking on the cap. And that's all. Recap the reservoir and you are done. In the next video, I'll be draining and refilling the coolant on the Avanza. So subscribe to my channel and don't miss that video. Bye!